So Harvard called, and you decided to follow the call.
Well, at first I thought, don't be silly, because I saw Harvard in 70. I think it was 70. Was it 76 when there was a convention in Boston?
Yes, the ALL was in Boston that year.
And
yeah.
Morris had some kind of event out at Harvard, which
I remember that.
I went to,
Mm-hmm.
and we got tours of Harvard Law School.
Mm-hmm.
I had never seen a more Dickensian, old-fashioned place in my life. I mean, it was impressive, no doubt, and the collections were quite wonderful.
Yeah.
But it was, the physical plant was horrible. The staff weren't comfortable with each other. It was, you know, technical infrastructure was really bad, and so when Harvard called and said, "Would you apply?" I said, "Oh, I saw the place. I'm flattered you asked and everything, but that's going to be a lot of work, And
bet you're right.
But I don't. And I'm not sure I'm talking to the search committee. I'm not sure you realize how much work it's going to be, because you're Harvard and you think you're wonderful, and most of the law school is wonderful, but the library isn't." And they said, "Well, actually, we do know." And so come on up and take a look. So I went up, and I think there were 4 candidates. And it was an interesting group, because Betty Taylor was one candidate. She was from Florida, and she was making a name for herself as one of the first embracers of the new information technology.
Yeah.
And another candidate was then the librarian at the undergraduate library at Harvard, who then went on to BC, Sharon Hamby. Then Sharon Hamby O'Connor.
Mm-hmm.
And she would have been very good, but she didn't really have the resume that Harvard was looking for at that time. Roy Mirsky was a candidate.
All right.
And Roy had just done the inspection for Harvard,
Mm-hmm.
and had been critical in a way that only Roy can be critical.
Did you burn too many bridges maybe to get the job?
And Dean Sachs, who was still the dean at the time, basically said, "Don't even think about it." Told the committee, "I'm not hiring Roy Mirsky." And so kind of I think Betty didn't have a good interview. Sharon didn't have quite the resume. So by a process of attrition, it came down to me. And which I was kind of surprised at, and then I had to think seriously about it.
Yeah. You have this wonderful sounding offer, and you got to think it through, huh?
Because, obviously a lot of potential in the place.
Well, you
Obviously
pretty well turned Georgetown around at that point, and there was potential there too, I would think.
Well, at Georgetown I had the support of the dean.
Yeah.
I had a good budget. They were good years financially for libraries, and so we were able to get like double-digit increases despite the inflation. We were doing well.
Yeah, that was pretty steep there too for a while.
The only difficult budget year I had at Georgetown, oddly enough, was the dean, David McCarthy. He was another great dean, I think. He had an advisory budget committee, 5 faculty, 5 students. They were only advisory, but he showed them the entire budget. And we went through everything and all the requests and everything, and the people, and so these 5 faculty and 5 students were kind of, stand-ins for, the community, and he took their feelings and reactions seriously. But the students were generally very responsible and acted, kind of individually.
Mm-hmm.
Until one year, when my research assistant, John Johnson, organized the students.
Oh.
And they voted as a block on everything.
And they had what, 5 out of the 10 votes or something?
And they had 5 out of the 10 votes.
Yeah.
So it was difficult. Now, the dean didn't have to follow them, and he didn't
Yeah.
follow every one of their suggestions and everything, but that was a small increase.
Mm.
John then went on to work for Lexus and did a great job. And when I was at Harvard, we did a couple interesting projects together. But that was an interesting time. So I had to think about it. But Harvard was getting a new dean, Jim Bornberg, and he said he understood what the library needed, in terms of more financial support. Harvard would sometimes run out of book money in April.
Mm.
It just had no more money to pay its invoices
Mm.
because it was just they hadn't spent they hadn't budgeted properly. They hadn't spent it. They didn't have
So
the
they
tools.
just-
They didn't have the tools to it
Run out and buy what they needed until they ran low on money and they'd stop.
because
That's the
everything
situation.
was paper.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
and the various departments wouldn't share information. So Muriel. We had the Moody sisters,
Oh, I remember
Margaret
Margaret.
and Muriel. And Muriel ran acquisitions, and she was the only one who knew, in theory, what was going on, except the cereals was a separate department, which Margaret had run and then had gone over to this publication. You remember the Harvard bibliography?
Oh, the annual legal bibliography. That was a wonderful source for
It was.
many of us.
It was.
Yeah. Fortunately, they couldn't sustain it forever. But
Well-
nice while they did.
Yes, it was a great publication, and I almost wish it had kept going. But Morris Cohen, who was my predecessor, was moving on to Yale. He didn't like administration. He was a true scholar, and
Yeah.
Harvard was just too big an operation, and he thought Yale would be more manageable, as I think it was.
It was a much smaller and tighter shop in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And,
And they'd had, Art Charpentier for
oh, he
years,
was gifted.
and he had everything organized.
Yeah.
So,
Stories of him when I was his assistant for a couple of years, and it was right as the end of the student unrest era of the
Mhm.
late 60s. And he literally was credited, and I think very, very much for the right reasons, of having kept the lid on that at the Yale Law School, single-handedly, speaking to the students. I don't think I've ever had a boss before, well, I haven't had too many afterwards, but deans maybe, who had a power megaphone in his closet in his office, but that was one of the tools of the trade for that era for him.
but also he was such a gentleman,
Oh, yes.
and he just insisted that you be a gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure he could do it, kind of force of personality to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Baring was Morris's assistant at Harvard, and he could have been the librarian after Morris, but his wife wanted to go back to California,
Okay.
or the West Coast anyway, so he
Yeah, they
went
went
back
to
to
Seattle
Washington
first,
for
yeah.
a couple of years and then down to
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
But Morris and Bob kind of agreed between themselves that, if they're going to get a good person in, they had to kind of clear out. So they killed off the annual legal bibliography, offered and insisted the Moody's take retirement, and there were a couple other positions open. So, Bornberg said, yeah, I understand, it's going to be work and it's going to require resources, but you'll have my support. And I thought, well, it's one of these challenges that, you know, you ought to take if you can.
Mhm.
So the only thing I specifically bargained for before I went, I said, well, you have to fix the roof of Langdell, because when it rained,
Mm.
it would just come right down into the reading room, and they would be putting out like a dozen buckets
Oh, yeah.
to catch the water on the tables, on the book stacks, you know. And so he
And that was
promised.
all wood, beautiful bookshelves and
Yes.
everything. I mean, they could have been just wrecked, I
Yeah.
imagine. Say nothing of the books.
So he promised a new roof,
Uh-huh.
and I thought, okay, let's see what I can do. So I agreed to go, and there were many open positions at that point.
Mm.
You know, I had to find a new associate. I had to find a head of cataloging. I had to find a head of acquisitions. I had to find all this stuff, and so it was quite busy the first
It
couple of
must
years.
have given you, though, the opportunity to sort of change the culture in the right sense.
Yeah, certainly at the senior management level, and that filtered down. But the first few years were difficult because, and when I came, there was a selector typewriter, and that's what did the catalog cards.
All right.
And Bob had actually found somebody that he thought would be a good head of cataloging, a young guy from the West Coast. And he said, we've interviewed a lot of people. I think he's very good, but if you're coming in, but my suggestion is hire him. And I said, well, go ahead and hire him and get him started. And then I had to make a decision even before I went to Harvard, what kind of system we're going to put in. Is it going to be OCLC? Is it going to be Arlen? Is it going to be a standalone system? And the head of, whoever was the head of Association of the Bar of the City of New York at the time, whose name escapes me for the moment, but Morris and the librarian at Columbia and the Association of the Bar were talking about putting together a consortium of those law libraries, and they wanted Harvard to join them. But the problem from Harvard's point of view was that we would have had to do all of the telecommunications over telephone lines.
Mm-hmm.
The computer was going to be in New York. And we didn't borrow very much from those libraries. We borrowed a lot from non-law libraries. We borrowed a lot from Harvard.
We
Other
basically
libraries.
had the legal collections in-house. for the
Yes,
most
and
part.
the only books we borrowed were from BC when ours were missing.
Uh-huh.
And that I fixed in short order by just duplicating the ones that needed to be duplicated.
Yeah.
We only had one copy of the Chicago faculty edited journal out of Chicago, Journal of Legal Study,
Mm.
and of course we had half a dozen faculty that wanted to read it, and
Mhm.
whoever got their hands on it first, kept it. So we just that was easy, fixing that. And we decided, Lee Layton and I, who was the guy they'd hired to do cataloging, we just had some talks, and we decided that we would not join this law consortium. We would join the university, which was now starting to talk about putting together a system of its own, and we would go with RLG, which then Harvard was part of RLG.
Mhm.
Harvard later left RLG and joined OCLC, and we stayed with RLG until the end. But so, we had to do a lot of technical services work, but I got myself put on the university committee that brought up a system for the university.
Mhm.
And after a couple of years, I found myself chairing the committee, and that was very interesting. It was unlike many law schools, academic law libraries that were very concerned about their independence
Mhm.
and didn't necessarily want to have a lot to do with the university library. At Harvard, all of the faculties were independent. Harvard was just a confederation of a whole bunch of individual libraries. And there, it was necessary to actively work on
So you
cooperations.
sort of have the culture of the, what would it be?
So there was a big
Central
library
living.
with
Yeah,
the law on the outline, or maybe medicine, you know.
Yeah.
Business, government, and then a whole bunch of independent libraries that weren't even part of the main central library. So, so it was odd, you know. I was perceived as kind of a good guy on the campus for wanting to cooperate, because it was never a question of giving up autonomy. Everybody, that was the assumption. It was just,
yeah.
how can we at least talk to one another? So, and that was very entertaining and educational and rewarding.
Mhm.
And we managed eventually to, you know, automate the catalog, and we eventually managed to, you know, bring up the public service aspect of it, and the whole thing generally worked. And when I took the catalogs, card catalogs, out of the reading room, all the windows were uncovered,
Oh,
and, you know, light would come in, because the whole center of the reading room was just filled with these card catalogs.
yeah, we had so many volumes and
Yeah.
cataloging them for many years.
And, you know, then we had to go to, and we decided to go to LC and, you know, bring up an electronic catalog, because at the time we had 3 separate physical catalogs. One for US law, one for foreign law, one for international law.
You also had a sort of a different kind of classification system
Well-
that put everything kind of in a general area, and you
Yep.
had to go down and hunt around on the stacks.
Yeah, the Moody's had
Until you found
invented their own classification system.
Yeah.
And when Harvard was a closed stack library, it was okay.
Mhm.
But then they built this international legal studies in the late 60s.
Oh,
And the foreign law books were put there.
yeah.
And
That
they
was
were
sort
on-
of a separate building. or
Separate
something,
building.
Separate, connected by corridors or something. But it was a separate,
It was
much
separate.
more modern kind of place.
modern at the time, yeah.
Yeah, at the time, yeah. This
And
the
it
60s.
was, and so the foreign law books ended up on OpenStax.
Uh-huh.
Well, now, that seems wrong. You mean, if you're researching foreign law, you can go directly to the book, and if you're researching American law, somebody has to get it for you, you know. And so we opened they opened the stacks in Langdell, but it had been designed only for book boys to run down and read books, so the stairways were very narrow, the ceilings were very low because it was stack supported. It was an odd physical plan.
Well, I remember even, I was there briefly at one point for field work, and in those days it was still supposed to be closed stacks, but it was very porous in the sense that faculty and others would always have
Yeah.
access through various doors elsewhere.
Well, that's true too. That's true too.
Yeah.
But we had, there were 2, after I went to Harvard, there were 2 AA conventions in Boston.
Mhm.
And we hosted the academic reception for both of them.
Mhm.
And the first one, of course, it being in July, it wasn't as hot as it could have been, but it was warm.
Mhm.
And of course, the library was not air conditioned.
Mhm.
And we had a nice reception in the reading room, but everybody was sweating. And what happened was, when Earl Borgeson had been librarian of the Harvard Law School, they had replaced the lights in the reading room, which had been dismal, you know, first generation electric lights, basically. And he hired a lighting designer from Broadway to come up and put in the ceiling. And it was a mixture of incandescent and fluorescent, and it ate electricity like you wouldn't believe, and it put out heat like you wouldn't believe. So in the winter, we never had to heat the reading room. But in the summer, if it got over a certain temperature and humidity combination, we basically had to turn the lights off.
Mm.
So I think we had to turn them off for the reception, you know. and
Hope the sun was bright that day.
and people were just, you know, they couldn't believe this was Harvard, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've been there 13, 14 years, finally got, you know, the agreement and the pre-planning done to renovate Langdell. And afterward, shortly right after, the year after, I think, AALL was back in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
So we hosted the reception again, and this time it was very nice because it had nice lighting and everything was air conditioned. And my strongest recollection of that reception was big long reading room. That was where the librarians were. And then we had a room kind of off to the side that was the reference department and the reference room, and we used that as a staging area for the caterers.
Mm-hmm.
And I was coming out of the reference room into the reading room once, and there's this small woman. I think she was probably from Latin America someplace, and she was hired to be a server, and she's standing there with a plate. And they were, I think, a plate of these little pork chops that Harvard was. We always thought they were great, and you know, if we could afford it, we always would serve them. And VNA was happy to put them on the menu. And she was standing with this plate, and she was just standing there. She wasn't going out. I said, "Why aren't you going out?" And she basically said, "I'm afraid." I said, "What do you mean you're afraid? Come on, let's go. Yeah, I'll go with you, you know." Opened the door, and she went out. And she took about 4 steps, and it was like a herd of locusts, you know, the law librarians just sitting on her.
They're all hungry, and
Whoop.
and they knew they better get quick
And in 20
access.
seconds, her
It's
tray
all
was
gone.
empty.
Yeah.
You know, I said, "Well, I can see what you mean, but they won't eat you." You know.
Well, maybe she didn't know that.
And oh, that was quite something.
Yeah, an interesting story. A lot of interesting stories, Terry. I guess we're probably getting towards the end of the
Yeah.
time we have. Before we do sort of wrap up, do you want to say a little bit about, a little bit more maybe about Harvard and how you ended up down here again at Texas after all full circle? I guess Roy had died and you were interim. And
Well, Harvard was it was a great place, and you know, the first few years were difficult, but I did have a lot of support. Had an excellent staff. We did manage to get the place looking like more or less a 20th century library before the end of the century. I think when we finally did the Langdell renovation project, that was a big deal. I had been on sabbatical in Germany. I had a half-year sabbatical when the committee, the planning committee, decided they had to make a decision whether they were going to do the renovation in 1 year or whether they were going to spread it over 3 or 4 years. And Marion Parker was my number 2 at the time, and she was sitting on the committee. And she called me in Germany and said, "All right, the committee's decided to do it in 1 year." And she said, "I told them you could do that." Because,
great.
Because I'm off to NYU. And as it turned out, that was probably the right decision, because otherwise we would have had 2 or 3 classes that had never seen a functioning library. This time it would have, you know, 3 classes would have had one bad year. But actually the planning for that worked very well. We moved almost all the books off-site, not the foreign law books, but all the American books off-site. Closed down special collections and turned everybody there into document delivery and ILL folks. Moved technical services to the off-site spot with the books. Had regular deliveries of books, and and faxing and so forth. Lexis and Westlaw helped a lot. And the students really, at the end of the year, when they kind of rated the services of the law school, gave the library an A.
Oh.
And the only problem was the following year, when everything was back in the building, and the building was working, and it was really, I thought, turned out quite well. Students would still come to the circulation desk and say, I'd like this book, please. And somebody would look and say, it's right upstairs, one floor up, right at the end, And they say, well, aren't you going to get it for me? We'd have to tell them, no, that was last year's.
That's full circle. You basically, the library was the stack boys going up and down finding things, hopefully finding them, and sending them up.
Well, we have
to open
actually
stacks, and now you're back to closed stacks for a year because they're not there.
Well, and since then, we've come back even more to closed stack because Harvard has a very well-run and extensive off-site storage facility, and more and more and more of the law school books have gone into that. We had, I counted, I think, something like 32 separate stack areas when I came to Harvard, and a lot of them in attics and basements and everything. Over the years, we've cleaned out all of those and moved them to off-site. We basically had just the two things, and now they're in the process of cleaning out the International Legal Studies building for something else. So there's only going to be one physical spot, so something like 80% of the collection is going to be
the
off-site.
library that was over in that building will be sort of folded back into the main part of the
Yes, so
facility.
in 4 years, those stacks will disappear, and we're back to being a closed stack library, or electronic. I mean, a lot of
Well,
electronic.
with the electronic, I mean, many of the students, I would think today, if it's not on a screen, they don't read it.
That's true too.
So
That's true,
cultures
too.
have changed.
The cultures have changed, and I actually thought that maybe by the time I retired from Harvard, we could have digitized everything, because we were one of the first places to deal with Google. And I was on the team that went out to California to talk with Google. I wangled my way onto the Harvard team, and it turned out that their intellectual property lawyer, I played trumpet at his wedding, so we had a good connection. And we got a tour of their little machine they designed to do digitization and everything. And I thought this was going to be wonderful. And I couldn't really understand why they were doing it, and so I asked my friend, give me 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, who's going to be your main competitor? And I was thinking at the time he was going to say Yahoo, because at this time kind of Yahoo and Google were running the major web searches things.
The web search engines, yeah.
And he said Amazon. And it took me a while, I couldn't figure out, but he knew that Amazon was making deals with publishers, was getting digital copy, and was even offering digital copy. And Google thought, they're in the business of making information available. And they started with the web, but the web only has other stuff. They needed to move into traditional print stuff too. Amazon had the kind of direct, at the time, they thought the direct publishers, so they were going to do the libraries. I thought, well, this is wonderful. So they came out and they set up shop at Harvard, and we started feeding them stuff. They didn't set up shop at Harvard, they rented a space someplace in New England, and they wouldn't tell us where. But I actually had one of my staff follow their truck one day, just so I knew kind of where it was and where the books were going.
In case you needed to get your books back, you'd know where to go get
But
them.
they were pretty responsive about that. And but as it turned out, half of the books in the Harvard collection are still under copyright. Here we're talking, what, 1.5 million books. Half of them are still under copyright.
Yeah.
And Larry Lessig and a couple of us thought, that's all right, let's do them anyway and claim fair use. And if we have to, we'll go to the federal court and get a, you know, in a declaratory judgment that this is fair use. But the Harvard Corporation was risk averse.
Oh,
So 50% of the books that were under copyright had to be taken off the table. Then Harvard didn't want the rare books going out because they didn't think Google would treat them carefully enough. And besides, these were unique resources, and if anybody's going to make money on unique resources, it should be Harvard. And then big books couldn't, if they were too big, they couldn't go out. If they were too small, they couldn't go out. If they weren't hardbound, they couldn't go out. If they were multi-piece, you know, bound with 3 or 4 pamphlets bound in one thing, they couldn't go out because Google software couldn't separate them into 3 or 4 different books, which I thought was ridiculous. We offered Google the entire Harvard catalog electronically, and they said, no, our software will. Well, since they've changed their tune and have now taken a catalog record. But so in the end, we only digitized 7% of the Harvard collection, Harvard Law collection.
the original plan was to do 100%.
Well, my goal was to do 100%,
Yeah.
you know, and then
Then
the goal was
finally ended up
50, and then it
7.
just kept being knocked away. So it's an ongoing project. But the other good thing about Harvard was, besides the incredible people you find there, there were a lot of professional opportunities that came to me when I was at Harvard. I was able to be I was asked to serve on the first board of Cali, and we started an ELCO. Don Dunn and a couple other people thought that, or their deans thought that libraries could work more together and save a lot of money by working together, and so
Don later became dean.
yeah, and then he became dean, and so they asked me, and I said, would Harvard join something like this? And I said, absolutely. And so we hosted the first, in fact, the first couple NALCO people were half-time Harvard staff, and got Harvard benefits, and then Yale took it over, and now NALCO's a freestanding thing. And so, I was at the first meeting where Bob Oakley ended up starting LIPA, and being involved in those kinds of kind of cooperative multi-library things, I thought were very interesting. Harvard offered so many opportunities. That we talked earlier about they had a great art collection, and they had almost a small museum. When I first got there, the people running this were all faculty spouses. One who did manuscripts, one who did art, one who did rare books, which was a daughter of a faculty member. And they all hated each other.
Oh.
And so, kind of managing the internal politics of that.
The Moody's all over again.
Took a while. Not as bad.
Not
as bad. But hate is probably the wrong word. But they were just such different personalities, and they each had their specialties, and they just had to be, managed carefully. I liked them all, and they were really great individually, but getting them to work together was sometimes a challenge.
Maybe they learned too much from their husbands over faculty.
I don't know.
Independence was good.
But and then I mentioned John Johnson, who had been a student at Georgetown. He ended up being
he's the one that organized your students in that committee. Yeah.
And then he went to work for Lexis. He and his wife went to work for Lexis, and he was kind of the first Lexis rep for law schools. And at the time I went to Harvard, we had one of these big old Lexis machines standing in a room. But Lexis was moving towards desktop technology,
Yeah.
and our students were getting, you know, desktops. And John and I, together, he for his reasons, I for my reasons, we wanted to have broader access for students. And the people that started Lexis had worked, you know, had been graduates of Harvard. So we made this proposal that every Harvard law student get 24-hour access to Lexis.
Mhm.
Because at the time, although you could download this special software and put it in a machine, you couldn't get access to it in the afternoon. There were only certain hours.
That's right, the computer capacity of the computers in those days and the number of accesses in the afternoon.
Yeah.
On the East Coast, they limited the academic access.
Yeah, because they wanted the investment bankers and the Wall Street lawyers to have access from 2 to 5 in the afternoon.
Depending
is
on
a
what
peak
time
period.
zone you were at, the time
Yep.
changed.
The
'Cause
time
it was
changed.
the same block of time, but across the country.
But I promised Lexis that that wasn't going to be when Harvard law students would be accessing it anyway.
Mhm.
And it would just be simpler just to give them access. So we ended up with this secret deal, which ran for a year, was a
Mhm.
pilot project, where every Harvard law student got their own password,
Mhm.
24-hour access. And as it turned out, peak access times were 10 p.m. to 2 a.m.
Well, students are doing their thing.
And that was very gratifying
Yeah.
to the Lexis people. What was surprising to them was that the overall use was a lot lower than they thought. They thought law students would just be on their machine all the time,
Overwhelm everything.
just doing nothing but searching Lexis 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
I tried to tell them that was unrealistic.
So they're probably hoping that after they graduated and were in the firms, that that's exactly how they
Well,
use it.
and it probably is,
Yeah.
you know, true. So I think the next year or the following year, they just rolled it out for all the law schools.
I remember when we got it, I mean, it
was
started
great.
out that there was one number, and then there were several numbers, and then
Then everybody-
you could do it at
Yeah.
times of the day that had been closed off
Yeah,
before.
and finally it was
Then
all
everybody
law
had a
students,
number.
24 hours a
Yeah.
day. And then we worked very hard to get some of the non-law materials on Lexis made available. And like New York Times and other things. And so they eventually put together what I call Lexis Lite, but I think it was, I forget what name they gave to it. And then that was actually picked up by universities.
That's when the university library started offering some
Yes,
of that.
because-
Because up until that, faculty from other parts of the campus
right,
were
and
not really supposed to use it.
No, and it was very aggravating, and I tried
Oh, I'll
to,
say.
and so they offered Lexis Lite through the whole university
Mhm.
at a very small premium, basically, and then started to add some of the non-law resources onto it, and that I think that was a good business decision for them, and it certainly was worked for us. So so the opportunity to kind of negotiate some of these things with the vendors has been was good.
Well, it was nice for those years too. We had Lexis and we had West, which was the predecessor of
Mhm.
today's Thomson Reuters. And they were so competitive, and they wanted access to the
Yes.
academic market because they wanted basically that access to give them customers after
right.
these guys graduated. These
Then
students.
then you remember they had that big lawsuit,
Oh, yes.
copyright lawsuit,
Yeah.
where Westlaw was claiming copyright in its page numbers or something.
Well, I remember, because I was on the executive board my first year, the second time I was on the board, that was one of the big issues that was just sort of wrapping up and had been very controversial and very, not everyone agreed on the right
Well,
thing.
it lasted for years.
Yeah.
I always thought it was totally unnecessary. And it certainly, it didn't help the image of either company.
No.
It didn't, you know, help relations with the librarian community. Eventually, I think they decided to settle, to negotiate the suit. And Lexis, if I remember right, Lexis hired Harvard's, Roger Fisher, Harvard's top negotiator, professor, getting to yes and all this.
Uh-huh.
And West hired Philip Arita, a great antitrust lawyer. And I always thought that the negotiation drastically favored West, you know, in terms of the legalities of the situation. I thought that it was very interesting to me that Phil did a better job negotiating than Roger did. But at least it was settled, and I think to the benefit of both companies and certainly of the profession, because it was really nasty for a while.
Well, I mean, they were, put it nicely, very, very competitive companies
Yes.
with each other, and we played that all the time. I mean, I had all sorts of stuff brought in that before we could buy our own computer stations. That both companies were putting in fairly large numbers of PCs.
Yep.
So that you could use them for their database, but the kids knew how to use them for anything. And
Well, the growth in the technology has really been incredible, and I think quite exciting. Do you remember the old Ubik terminals?
oh yes, with the so-called
little
chiclet
chiclet keys?
keys. Yes.
I think Harvard has one of those in its
Yeah. And then
special collection.
West came out with something called the Walt. And they were
Mhm.
actually both Ubik and Walt were dumb terminals. They were not
Yep.
computers, but the Walt looked like a computer. So a lot of the kids were using that because you know the other one didn't look right. It's funny how the market would shift back and forth. And,
Well, I talked to the guy who invented the Ubik
Mhm.
once, and I said, why don't you just put in a regular keyboard? And he said, we didn't want searching to look like typing, because typing is something the secretaries did,
Yeah.
not lawyers.
That was still that era.
And there were,
Yeah.
and then he told me stories of times when they would run training sessions for Lexis,
Mhm.
and lawyers would bring their secretaries to do the typing. They would stand and the secretaries would type what they were told, you know.
Mhm.
And I remember there was one time when the, I don't know, but it must have been with some kind of small computer, where the guy was so excited at a demo they brought up on the screen the information he wanted, that he wanted to take the screen over and photocopy it. You know, he didn't understand that it could be printed
You
out.
couldn't do that.
So it was just, you know.
There was a better way.
Now people are very comfortable with the technology, and it's going in all directions, and I
Well,
think that's great.
The first computers that came in for secretaries to type on, replacing the Selectric typewriters and others, the salesman didn't want to call them computers, because that's the sort of thing you saw if you went down to NASA or the government had
Yeah.
big computers, but regular people, that was a turnoff. They were afraid. And I remember buying a word processor unit for the law school. I was serving as associate dean for budget on the side of being a law library director for a while. And, I looked at this thing and I said, "Oh, that looks like a computer." Oh, the salesman was beside himself. "Oh, no, it's not a computer. It's a word processor." well, we got it, and within months,
Yeah.
the faculty were arguing as to whose manuscripts got done on that thing as opposed to a typewriter.
That's
Boy,
right.
they turned them around fast.
Yeah, and you could correct them easily. And
Oh.
I was walking through the exhibit hall just before I came over here, and it's been interesting to see how the exhibit hall has changed over the years. I mean, it used to be almost 90% books.
Yeah.
And then various kinds of equipment would come in. There might be furniture people there, and then copiers were big for a while.
I remember one, I think it was Phil Cohn of Oceana, had a film viewer one time. Boy, we thought that was state of the art.
Yep. Now they have, you know, scanners and film digitizers, and I didn't see any 3D scanners at this convention, but
That's starting to come in.
it might come in too, and
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, how would a law school use that, but.
Well, if there's a way, somebody will
Well, actually,
figure it out.
one of the students at UT Law School scanned, produced, doing 3D copying, a gun,
Mm.
a working pistol,
Oh,
and you could put a bullet in it and you could fire it. And it was not metal except for the bullet.
mhm.
The only problem was, once the bullet went through the barrel melted.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a one-shot pistol, but
Still, that may be
bit
quite
scanny,
adequate.
bit scanny, and that's of course something that might only happen in Texas, but
Well, imagine it makes the folks in airport security
Oh,
nervous. That
very
kind of
nervous.
possibility.
very nervous. So, you know,
Well,
not all technological developments are always for the best, but it's always been very interesting. And it's
Well-
you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 to 20 years
well, I've
with
heard-
technology and with
I've
the
heard
profession.
some people say that with computer memory doubling every 18 months and speed doubling about every 2 years, which is what I read is the norm, that we haven't seen anything yet. We can't even imagine
Good.
what will be going on in a few years. Well, we'll see. Or, well, somebody will see, I don't know.
Somebody will see.
That will still be on our watch.
Yes.
But, well, maybe on that, we should probably wrap up, and I should thank you on behalf of not just myself, but Dick Spinelli, Michelle Wu, and Frank Kodak, our colleagues with whom I have the opportunity and honor to be talking with people like yourself, Terry Martin, today for the oral history of law librarianship section of Pine Online.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I think it's a great effort. And you've put in hours and hours on this, and
Well,
I
I've
commend you
been
for it.
enjoying it immensely. You know, retired, and I'm able to do it at this point. It's a nice project, and I enjoy it.
Great.
And I like what we're accomplishing. You know.
Excellent.
Some very interesting stories out there, including the one that we heard today that will be part of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.